A beloved man goes completely off the radar.
He wasn't answering any calls.
It's not normal that his mother would not have heard from him.
The family's request for a welfare check leads to a devastating discovery.
I think we're smelling a DOA.
He's been there for weeks. The smell is overpowering.
It's quickly clear this was a crime of passion.
Whoever did this knew him.
But who's behind it?
We are done!
Conflict started to arise.
Get out!
Like a lot of couples, they have disagreements.
But police officers noticed feminine products within the bathroom. He was dating this female.
As detectives seek the truth, the mystery only deepens.
They received very odd text messages.
She wrote yesterday, his brother has cancer again. She claimed to tell me that he had his leg amputated.
They don't know if any of that is true.
Will investigators be able to cut through the lies?
She was under the influence of drugs. She puts on a show.
Oh my gosh. What's going on?
This whole story is put together by disproving lies.
February 18th, 2020. It's Tuesday afternoon in San Antonio, Texas's second largest city.
It's both a big city and a small town. It's very family-oriented. It's very diverse.
You see a vibrant mix of African Americans with Hispanic Americans.
There are over 1.5 million residents there.
But this afternoon, one of those 1.5 million people has gone missing. 57-year-old Ohio transplant, Christopher Jones.
The last time anybody from the family had heard from him was the 25th of January.
Chris was very close with his mother. He tried to speak with her every Sunday.
After the first Sunday passed, it was kind of like, okay, maybe he was busy and got distracted.
His mother had told his aunt, Teresa, that Chris just wasn't answering any of the calls.
After the third week, I called the police department. I said, can you do a well check on my nephew? Because it's not normal that his mother would not have heard from him by now.
When officers arrive at Christopher's house, they knock on the door and get no response.
Take a look around.
They noticed that the home is locked and the windows are locked.
As one of the officers heads around the back of the house and continues trying the doors and windows, he notices a familiar odor.
He was able to smell the actual smell of body decomp.
This is a distinct smell. I get it by the back door a lot more.
This led police officers to request fire support to force entry into Chris's home.
So I think we're smelling a DOA. So we're gonna have fire do a force entry.
Originally from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, 57-year-old Christopher Jones had spent several years in the Army as a young man.
When he was stationed in Hawaii, he was on the back of a Jeep or something, and the Jeep hit something, it threw him off, and actually his back was messed up, and they put him on disability.
After being discharged, Chris returned to Ohio, where he met and fell in love with his soon-to-be wife.
For a while, Chris worked at a local restaurant to support himself.
Chris was manager at one of the restaurants in Columbus, and she was working there, and that's where they met. They got married a year or two later.
Over the next several years, the couple had 4 children. But eventually, she and Chris found it too hard to make their relationship work.
When their youngest son was just 3 months old, the couple ended up separating.
Just like a lot of couples, they have disagreements and they separated. It happens.
Sadly, in the course of the separation, Chris ended up becoming estranged from his 4 kids.
She was young. She felt she was doing the right thing.
Losing contact with his kids left Chris feeling empty. Searching for purpose, he found himself in San Antonio, where he decided to pursue his first love, music.
During Chris's youth, he picked up a love for gospel music.
He taught himself how to play guitar and the keyboard.
Now, he was actually in the process of working on a gospel album.
People that are out there hurting, he wanted to let them know, God brought me through this and he'll bring you through it too. Everything was coming together for him.
And one day, a dream even more important to Chris finally came true.
He finally found his children. That was his whole goal in life, to find his children, complete the CD, and have a normal life. Everything was good, they reunited, had plans to be back together.
Chris immediately started making plans to meet up with them that summer and reestablish their relationships.
I can't wait to see you.
They were connected again by phone, but they were all going to come in and have like a reunion.
But now, that long-awaited reunion may never occur, as firefighters are forcing entry into Chris's home to locate the source of a suspicious smell.
As soon as that door opens, everybody reacts.
The source of the odor is immediately evident.
They walk in and see a deceased black male lying on his back with a towel laid across him.
The towel was laying over, like somebody put on him.
Yes, ma'am. Can you give me an extension to homicide? Probably gonna need to have them come out.
After years of estrangement from his children, 57-year-old Christopher Jones had finally reconnected with them.
I can't wait to see you.
In the summer of 2020, Chris was making plans to reunite with his kids, and they were going to come visit with him in San Antonio.
Chris was also in the process of achieving one of his lifelong dreams, recording a gospel album.
Everything's perfect. Chris is stable, he's got his music going. It's gonna be good.
But now, a welfare check requested by Chris's family has resulted in a devastating discovery inside his San Antonio, Texas home.
Can you give me an extension to homicide? Probably gonna need to have them come out.
Police that called the fire department to come and break down the door.
They go inside, and that's where they see Chris's body laying on the floor with his upper torso covered with a towel.
I got a DOA that we finally got the door open, smelled the smell of death, and fire got it open. The gentleman's laying on his back with a towel over him with some blood on the floor.
He's been there for weeks at this point. The smell of body decomp is overpowering.
As homicide detectives arrive at the scene, they're briefed by the officers.
Let me ask you a couple things for one. So the towel, did fire do that? Did you ask them?
Nope, that was how we found it.
Before going inside the house, some of the investigators put on gas masks to minimize the smell.
Even if you're used to it, you could have a visceral reaction to it.
The first thing detectives want to do is ensure there are no other victims in the house.
We need to clear the house.
Once the house is cleared, detectives turn their attention to the body. The level of decomposition is so severe that it's not immediately obvious how Chris died.
He was so decomposed.
Detectives do note some dried blood on the carpet around Chris's head. And that's not the only interesting evidence.
There was also other weird things around the body, like an insulin needle.
They also see gauze near his body. It appears that some type of attempt, potentially for life-saving measures.
A look around the rest of the house doesn't reveal any signs of a robbery.
They don't see any other type of forced entry. There's valuable items in the home as well that hadn't been taken.
Chris's really expensive music equipment and sound equipment was still within his home and didn't seem to be touched.
Nothing else looked like disturbed or tossed around in the other room. On the bed.
Still in there, TV,
And yeah, the guitars.
It was clear whoever did this knew Christopher.
They did notice one thing evidently missing from the house, though.
In the bedroom, they found a gun case for a Smith & Wesson. The gun was gone, but there was some ammunition.
And in the bathroom, there was evidence that Chris didn't live alone.
Police officers notice feminine products within Chris's bathroom. So they really want to know more about this female.
And when they spoke to the neighbors reported that he lived there with a Hispanic woman.
Okay, you remember what the male looked like?
He looked like an older guy.
What did the female look like?
She looked a lot younger, and she was pregnant.
However, the neighbor says recently that seemed to have changed.
Last time I saw it, it didn't look like the stomach was there anymore. I was wondering what happened to a baby because I hadn't seen her come out with no baby.
The neighbor also says that it's been a few weeks since she saw either Chris or the woman.
How long ago was it that you saw him?
It's been about a little over 2 weeks. We had a Cadillac, white Cadillac.
Yes, sir.
No, I hadn't seen it there in a while.
However, the neighbor says that she did see someone else there more recently.
The guy came over to the house, knocked on our door about a couple of days ago, a black guy, and asked him, have we seen him? He was driving an SUV.
Another neighbor says she doesn't know Chris or his mystery girlfriend well, but has talked to the girlfriend on occasion.
She came over and talked sometimes to the girlfriend. When we first met her, she seemed a little off. And then we kind of just kept our distance.
Asked when she last saw the couple, she gives a similar timeline to the other neighbor.
Almost a few days before New Year's.
After speaking with the neighbors, detectives take some time to regroup.
Right now, the top priority is identifying and locating Chris's girlfriend. She could be another victim, a witness, or even a suspect.
But first, detectives reach out to Chris's aunt to deliver the tragic news.
We waited and waited. Hours went by.
Hello?
Said something is not right. I knew what had happened, that it wasn't good.
Ma'am, I'm so sorry to have to tell you this.
No, oh my God, no.
I can imagine that this was very difficult for Chris's family to have to face over the phone.
But when the detective asks Chris's aunt if she knows anything about his girlfriend, she's surprised by her answer.
She said, yeah, he was dating this female, and her name was Mary Diaz.
Just to be honest, I don't know a lot about her.
Christopher's family had never met Mary in person, but just a few days ago, they received very odd text messages from her.
She said she had a miscarriage.
I didn't know she was pregnant.
Chris Jones's aunt has just told detectives investigating his death that since he disappeared, the family had been getting some strange texts from his girlfriend, Mary Diaz.
I never met Mary in person, and that's what really surprised me.
The texts came from Chris's phone, and at first, they were sent as Chris.
But they quickly realized something wasn't quite right.
It wasn't his texting style, his spelling, his punctuation, nothing.
They were just kind of like, this isn't Chris. And honestly, some of them didn't really make sense.
And they were just like rambling, incoherent, not like Chris at all.
Then things got even more strange.
All of a sudden, I got a text message from Chris's phone from her.
It was odd for them. If you were just trying to communicate to these family members as Mary, why wouldn't you use your own cell phone?
But one thing Mary texted was particularly shocking.
The messages were stating that she was pregnant and had recently had a miscarriage.
I didn't know anything had even happened to Chris at that point, but I knew then this doesn't make sense.
I think getting that text message really solidified, hey, something's wrong.
That's not the only strange thing Mary texted either.
Mary also mentioned that Chris was depressed because of the recent miscarriage.
She said he's gone to California, that he doesn't want to talk to anybody.
But eventually, when there was no more communication, the family decided it was time to ask for help.
I said, something is wrong. Everything is going good. He would not just up and leave.
Before detectives can look further into Mary Diaz, they receive an unexpected tip to contact a certain couple in Chris's friend group.
They possibly have some information about Mary and Chris.
So investigators head to the couple's house to learn more.
He says that he is a close friend of Chris.
He wanted some music, so he wanted me to help him finish his business.
Okay.
But the couple tells the detective that they haven't actually seen Chris in a while.
Last time I saw him was after Thanksgiving.
Okay, so it's been a few months since you've actually seen him.
Yeah.
Okay. When's the last time you've heard from him, though? Like,
The last time I heard from him, I'll tell you the exact day, Thursday, December 17th at 6:17 p.m.
He says that later texts and calls to Chris went unanswered.
I said, hey bro, are you okay? I've been trying to call you.
when was that? When did you send that to him?
Thursday, February 4th. And then I sent another one February 11th.
Okay, and no response?
No response.
He says he finally got a response 2 days later, but it wasn't the one he expected.
But that wasn't Chris
Yeah.
texting me.
It was Mary.
They received some really disturbing messages.
Chris's father passed away?
Well, that's what she says.
We don't know. That had been,
His mother was dying. She wrote yesterday, his brother has cancer again.
And then the strangest message of all came through.
She claimed to tell me that he had his leg amputated.
They were familiar with Christopher's past in the military. He had a bum knee, but it was nothing to the point of a leg amputation.
At that point, the couple says they decided to call Mary and try to figure out what was going on.
And in that phone call, Mary begins rambling and not really making much sense,
I wanted a no catch up.
leading them to believe that something isn't right.
basically she just started rattling on and on, kind of talking out of her head.
Yeah.
It wasn't making any sense.
And when they asked Mary when she'd last talked to Chris, they were even more surprised by her response.
Chris?
This brings up red flags for them, leading them to go over to Chris's house just to see what's going on with these messages they received from Mary.
When they get to his home, the door is locked, the windows are locked.
I told her, I said, doesn't look like nobody's there. No cars.
They decide to talk to neighbors to see what they know. But at that point, the light bulbs go off for the detectives. These are the people that the neighbors were telling them about.
The couple says they then decided to file a missing persons report for Chris.
They told me that he was an adult, so they couldn't put out missing persons.
Missing persons for adults can be difficult because it takes a lot to show that they are missing, like in a nefarious way.
But Chris's friends explained that by then, they didn't really think Chris was just missing.
We both suspected Mary had done some foul play.
And why would that be?
Why? Because she's wacko.
According to friends of 57-year-old Chris Jones, his girlfriend, Mary Diaz, is responsible for his death.
They tell police they believe Mary has something to do with Christopher's demise.
They had observed kind of erratic behavior in her and seemed to think that she was under the influence of drugs.
He had told me that, she was having problems with, drugs, substance abuse and stuff like that.
Now police are looking at this case completely differently.
No. He said she was selling pills. I think he was saying that she's on a little bit of everything.
And that's not the only thing Chris told his friends.
At one point in the past, Chris had told him that Mary had threatened him with a gun.
You're sitting on the window!
Back like November or December, she had come in and put a gun to his head.
Did he ever report that she had pulled a gun on him, anything like that?
No, we kind of just, laughed it off and, joked.
But he identified Mary as a jealous woman.
He also says that Chris was clear with Mary about the nature of their relationship.
I don't think he was trying to be exclusive with her.
Chris wasn't interested in a long-term relationship, and he was really in the relationship to be a support person for Mary.
She was back and forth.
She was.
Okay. Yeah.
Mary was more dependent on Chris for housing and support financially, and just giving that emotional support for her.
But now that Chris is dead, his friends suspect Mary's jealousy played a role, even if she wasn't the one who actually killed him.
At the end of the interview, detectives agree that Mary's jealousy could have a connection to Chris's death.
And when detectives return to the police station,
come check this out.
They learn that Chris was definitely murdered.
What we got? He is shot in the upper left portion of his back, and it comes out through his neck. So in the pathway, it actually tears his jugular. And so ultimately, it's that one gunshot wound that causes his death.
I need to put in a bolo.
With a now confirmed homicide in their hands, detectives focus their efforts on tracking down Mary.
They put out a bolo or be on the lookout for both Mary and Chris's car. They were running Mary's name, her date of birth, stuff like that, just to see if there was any other reports Mary's reflected in.
They find that on January 29th, Mary had contacted the police herself. However, this wasn't to report that Chris was missing. She was actually notifying them that she had been robbed.
Detectives are able to find body cam footage from the officers who responded to the incident. And it's explosive.
Hello. They come out and take a statement from her, and she appears intoxicated and is babbling.
I need to pay because my boyfriend, his dad's supposed to pass away. Well, I told him, I said, I need to come up with money and I don't want to bother him. He's screaming right now. I said, this machine, we don't need it.
Mary took some of Chris's recording equipment and she was going to sell it.
According to Mary, the incident had started off as a simple transaction between friends.
Mary told officers that when she met up with a friend who was going to buy the equipment, another man who was in the car with him stuck a gun in her face.
What she tells the police is that, they took the recording equipment and they robbed me.
I look up and there's a gun in my face and I grabbed it and I was putting it away, right? And he said, let go of my gun. I said, take the machine. No life is worth this stuff, you can have it.
And what kind of car were you in?
When they left, she began knocking on doors in this apartment complex until someone allowed her to use their phone.
The body cam footage then shows officers heading to the management office, hoping to view surveillance from around the apartment complex.
When they pull up the footage, they see a SUV just like what Mary described.
Officers also located a witness who saw the SUV, but his story differed from Mary's.
I see somebody back there, but I don't know about the robber.
Did you see a female get out of the car?
They were just sitting there.
It's clear the officers were starting to grow more suspicious of Mary.
Police run Mary's name and find out that she has 8 warrants out for her arrest. So they take her into custody for those warrants.
But before taking her down to headquarters, police conduct a search on Mary.
While they're searching her, she has Xanax and Viagra on her.
What are those?
They're my Xanax and my panic attacks.
Okay.
What's this pill here?
It's my boyfriend's favorite.
Mary also had several of Chris's personal effects on her person.
She has Chris Jones's wallet, she has his cell phone, and she has his Rolex watch. And then she also has a bullet in her pocket.
But for the detectives investigating Chris's murder, that's not the most interesting discovery officers made on January 29th.
In the front strap of her bra, she has a gun magazine.
It's a loaded .40 caliber Smith & Wesson magazine.
That magazine has the same type of caliber of the ammunition that was found in the house.
And the same as the gun missing from Chris's home.
Detectives investigating the murder of 57-year-old Christopher Jones have learned that just 4 days after his last communication with anyone, patrol officers had arrested his girlfriend, 35-year-old Mary Diaz.
What am I being charged with?
For your warrants and possession of your Xanax.
She also, in her bra, had a magazine. It was a .40 caliber.
That's the same caliber as the gun that was missing from Chris's home.
She's arrested, she's taken into custody, and she bonds out.
But just a day after Chris's body was found, she's back on police's radar.
Mary again contacted police to report a burglary.
This time, the officer finds her standing outside a house about 4 miles from Chris's home.
Chris had this house that a good friend of his lived in.
Let's go check it out.
Okay. Mary tells them she was driving by in Chris's car and she noticed a broken window.
When officers knock on the door, the tenant seems confused to see them.
Have you had a burglary here?
Burglary?
Yeah.
No burglary here.
No broken window or anything?
Just open.
She has no idea what's happening.
The responding officer leaves with more questions than answers.
Let's go have a talk to her.
We don't really understand what the point of her calling police was. It didn't appear that there was a burglary taking place.
But then he quickly realizes that Mary is connected to another active case.
He ends up taking her into custody at that point for questioning.
And they arrange for the car to be towed to the crime lab.
At the station, detectives finally get to sit down with Mary for the first time. They start by asking her about the burglary call that day.
She says that Chris has been renting the house out to his friend.
Once again, though, Mary starts rambling and never explains why she felt the need to call in a burglary at the house.
Sensing that they're getting nowhere, detectives switch tracks and ask Mary what she knows about Chris's whereabouts.
She tried to tell them, oh, he's in California, taking care of his dad.
He got a call that his dad was out of the hospital and put on hospice. He wanted me to go fly with him, and I said, terrified to fly.
At that point, the interview starts to go off the rails.
She became really reactive emotionally, started to cry, started discussing this miscarriage that she experienced.
It was kind of like, I wish I didn't get pregnant. Because he got so depressed.
When detectives ask Mary about the texts to Chris's aunt, she plays dumb.
His aunt contacted us and said that you had messaged her from his phone and said something about that he was going to be blocking everybody. Your family.
I didn't know who it was.
She also makes excuses for why she has Chris's phone and wallet.
He just told me that he was going to go and that I had to pay whatever had to be paid.
But what is he doing for money and everything else?
Chris has money.
Well, he hasn't been using it anywhere.
When detectives asked Mary about how Chris could travel without his ID, Mary doesn't have an answer.
He left you his car and he left you his driver's license and credit cards. So did he teleport there? How did he get to California, ma'am?
That's when detectives find a good opening to confront Mary about the murder.
I just want to know what happened. Chris never left, and you know that.
I don't know what happened.
Chris is dead, okay? Chris is dead. And all I'm asking you is to have some compassion and at least say what happened to him.
And then Mary puts on a show. So there's intelligence buried in there. She starts kind of crying hysterically. She's just kind of a chronic manipulator.
But no matter how hard detectives press, Mary refuses to admit any involvement in Chris's death.
She won't admit to anything. She keeps insisting that she had Chris's permission to have his belongings.
Unfortunately, the evidence isn't strong enough to tie Mary to the murder just yet. So they're forced to end the interview and let her go.
However, they hang on to the cell phone, and when they look through it, they find something very interesting.
On Mary's phone is a series of messages between her and one of her friends.
Mary was kind of freaking out about the relationship with Chris and that it was coming to an end.
In one message sent on the night investigators think Chris was killed, Mary told her friend that Chris had asked her to move out.
Basically, she was saying stuff about oh, he's gonna leave me with nothing.
Detectives ask Mary's friend to come in for an interview.
She is cooperative. She seemed to have known kind of the most, possibly, of what was going wrong in that relationship.
She tells detectives that shortly after she got the text, Mary showed up unexpectedly at her door.
She was crying. She was, basically naked.
Oh my gosh. Mary, what's going on?
Chris and we got into a bad fight.
And she says she couldn't believe what Mary told her next.
She tells her that she killed Chris.
I shot him.
A friend of Mary Diaz has just told the detectives investigating Chris Jones's murder that Mary confessed to killing him.
He's hurt. What do you mean he's hurt?
I shot him.
And detectives want to know why she hadn't come to the police with this information sooner.
Did it not occur to you to call the police?
I told her we should, but she said she already did.
She says it wasn't until she saw Chris's obituary she knew that Mary hadn't called the police.
But is Mary's hysterical confession to her friend enough to get a murder conviction?
After all, Mary had already demonstrated a tendency towards drama and stretching the truth.
She made numerous lies in this case. This whole story is put together by lies.
Thankfully, though, detectives get more solid evidence when they finally track down Chris's missing gun.
One of the detectives had put out an alert for the gun and serial number. And there was another detective who was doing gang work, and he was just going through known gang members' Facebook profiles, kind of seeing what people are up to. And this one guy posted a photo with him and his new gun.
It's a good enough picture that we're able to read the serial number on it.
He ran the serial number, and lo and behold, it is our missing Smith & Wesson. They were able to track down that gentleman and find out the gun went through 3 different gang members' hands before we recovered it.
Detectives eventually tracked down the person who originally sold Chris's gun, the man Mary accused of robbing her.
The police were able to actually use surveillance footage from the apartment complex where everything went down, and they got the license plate.
There's a disagreement. They see that she has the weapon in between her legs in the car. They ask her why she has that.
Protection.
She says it's for protection, and there's a struggle over the gun.
If you're gonna be like that, you can just get out.
Fine.
We're keeping this.
The people who were gonna buy that music box actually steal that weapon from her at that point.
Turns out the gun was unloaded the whole time. Mary must have put the magazine in her bra before she met up with the guys.
Detectives believe this gun was used to kill Chris, although there's no way to be absolutely sure.
Ultimately, it is our belief that it was this weapon, but we can't say for sure. We're unable to do this type of tool mark analysis to make sure that this is the exact gun.
Still, the gun, coupled with Mary's friend's statement of her confession, is enough to bring Mary back in for questioning.
They go at her harder that second time, really pushing her on the murder now that they've established something they can hold her on.
But no matter how hard they press, Mary doesn't budge.
What happened where Chris was killed?
She is non-responsive to most of it. There's no lie that she could come up with at that point that could make any sense with what we had.
Mary definitely didn't know that we had the gun. In Mary's mind, that gun is long gone.
Detectives give her one final chance to come clean. To no avail.
Well, I'm asking you again, what happened that day? The last day he was alive, what happened?
I don't know. I don't know at all.
She still won't confess to anything. So at that point, she is placed under arrest for the murder of Chris Jones.
News of Mary's arrest brings comfort to Chris's family back in Ohio.
We were very relieved. The detective said she wasn't going to stop until she got justice for him. And she kept her word.
But Mary will never stand trial for murdering Chris.
Facing the possibility of life in prison if a jury convicts her, Mary's attorneys agree to take a plea deal.
Mary and her defense team do not contest the prosecution's claim that she'd killed Chris because he was kicking her out of his house.
We are done! Get out of the house!
Chris Jones had had enough with Mary. She had lied to him. She was pretending to have been pregnant and then pretending to have miscarried. He made it very clear to her that she was going to be leaving his home, and she grabbed Chris's gun and she shot him in the back.
At her sentencing, the judge hands down the maximum penalty allowed by the plea deal.
She's sentenced to 25 years in the Texas prison system.
Still, to his loved ones, it will never be enough to make up for their loss.
They couldn't have given her enough time. No amount of time is going to bring Chris back.
He was a father. He loved music. He was a great person. And this woman took all of those great things from them.
But I know that Chris is with God. He's okay, and it's not the end. We will be back together again.
The barracks were supposed to be one of the safest places on a military base. Behind those doors were young soldiers living far from home, following orders, building careers, believing that the uniform around them meant protection. But in Hanau, Germany, in November 2001, one room became the center of murder that will remain unsolved for more than 2 decades. A 19-year-old soldier was dead. She was 4 months pregnant. Her killer was somewhere beyond the locked doors of the barracks, somewhere among the people who had known her, spoken to her, passed her in the hallways, and watched the investigation begin. For years, investigators had a body, a crime scene, a grieving family, and a question that refused to disappear. Who killed Private First Class Amanda Gonzalez? Amanda had arrived in Germany only about 8 months earlier. She was assigned to Headquarters Supply Company, 127th Aviation Support Battalion, working as a cook at Flederhorst Kaserne near Hanau. She was 19 years old. To many people on the base, she was simply another young soldier trying to build a life inside the military. But to her family in Texas, she was much more. She was a daughter, a young woman with plans, someone who had left home believing the Army could become the beginning of something bigger. Then came November 3rd, 2001. According to the evidence later presented in federal court, that was the day Amanda was killed inside her barracks room. Investigators determined that she had been beaten and strangled. The violence happened behind a door in a military installation, in a place where routines were normally predictable and people were expected to know where their fellow soldiers were. 2 days later, the silence became impossible to ignore. Amanda failed to report for work. Her absence triggered concern, and soldiers eventually entered her third-floor barracks room. What they found changed the base forever. Amanda Gonzalez was dead. The initial investigation classified her death as a homicide by asphyxiation. There was no question that this was not an accident. Someone had entered her world and ended her life. And Amanda was pregnant. That detail transformed the investigation. Her death was not simply the killing of a 19-year-old soldier. An unborn child was lost as well. The case immediately became one of the most disturbing murders connected to the U.S. military community in Germany. Investigators from Army Criminal Investigation Command began examining the room, Amanda's relationships, her movements, her communications, and the people who might have had access to her. But the investigation did not produce an immediate arrest. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And the case began to harden into something investigators feared most. A cold case. The base continued to operate. Soldiers transferred. Assignments changed. People returned to the United States. Careers continued. New faces arrived. Old faces disappeared. But Amanda remained dead, and the question of who killed her remained unanswered. Her family refused to let the case disappear. In the years that followed, Amanda's relatives repeatedly pushed for answers. Her father, Santos T.C. Gonzalez, spoke publicly about his frustration. He received calls from investigators updating him on the case, but each update brought the same unbearable reality: no arrest. The passage of time became part of the tragedy. Every anniversary marked another year without justice. Every birthday became a reminder that Amanda would never grow older. Every unanswered question became heavier. And yet, investigators did not simply forget her. The Army continued to classify the murder as a cold case. A reward was eventually increased to $100,000 for information leading to the apprehension and conviction of those responsible. Authorities publicly appealed to anyone who knew something, anyone who had seen something, anyone who had remained silent for years. The message was simple. Someone knew. The question was whether that person would ever speak. For Amanda's family, the uncertainty was devastating. They did not know whether the killer had been a stranger who somehow entered the barracks, someone Amanda trusted, or someone who had been standing close to her in the days before her death. There was another question investigators could not ignore. Who might have had a motive? Amanda's pregnancy became central to the investigation. Her unborn child had a father, and according to evidence eventually presented more than 2 decades later, prosecutors would argue that the man who killed Amanda believed he might be the father. His name was Shannon L. Wilkerson. At the time of the murder, Wilkerson was also serving in the U.S. military. He was not an unknown figure from the outside. He was part of the military environment. And that fact would make the eventual breakthrough all the more disturbing. But in 2001, investigators did not have a conclusion that prosecutors would later present in federal court. They had suspicion. They had evidence. They had unanswered questions. And they had time working against them. Wilkerson eventually left active duty. He was discharged from the Army in 2004 and later from the Army Reserve in 2007. Life moved forward. He lived outside Germany. The military base where Amanda had been killed eventually closed. But a murder does not disappear simply because a building closes. The room where Amanda died became part of the past. The investigation became a file. The witnesses became older. The soldiers move on. And for years, the case seemed trapped in 2001. Then, more than 2 decades after Amanda's death, something changed. Investigators returned to the case. Old evidence was reconsidered. Old information was examined through a different lens. And the name that had been connected to Amanda's final days began moving from suspicion toward prosecution. On February 23, 2023, federal authorities arrested Shannon L. Wilkerson in Florida. 21 years had passed. The cold case was suddenly alive again. For Amanda's family, the news was almost impossible to absorb. For years they had heard that investigators were still working. Now there was an arrest. But an arrest was not a conviction. Wilkerson was charged with first-degree murder under federal law. Because the alleged killing occurred overseas while he was a member of the armed forces, the United States government relied on the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act to bring the case into federal court. The investigation that began in Germany in 2001 had crossed continents. The barracks were gone. The years were gone. But the case had followed Amanda's killer into the future. And suddenly, after 22 years, the silence surrounding her death was beginning to crack. The question was no longer simply who killed Amanda Gonzalez. It was whether prosecutors could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And that would require taking a murder committed in a German barracks in 2001 and rebuilding it, piece by piece, inside an American courtroom more than 2 decades later. The past was about to become evidence. And every detail of Amanda's final days would be examined again. For more than 20 years, the murder of Amanda Gonzalez existed in the uncomfortable space between certainty and uncertainty. Everyone knew she had been murdered. Everyone knew where she died. Everyone knew when her body was discovered. But knowing that a crime happened is not the same as proving who committed it. That distinction is everything in a homicide investigation. In 2001, the evidence did not immediately lead investigators to an arrest. The military community in Hanau was large enough for countless possibilities to emerge and disappear. Soldiers came and went. Relationships changed. Memories faded. Some witnesses eventually returned to civilian life. Others were stationed in different countries. And as the years passed, the case became harder. But Amanda's family continued asking questions. The family had to live with the strange cruelty of a cold case. The victim's life stops at 19, but everyone around her continues aging. Amanda never got older. Her friends did. Her relatives did. The soldiers who knew her did. The investigators did. And somewhere in that passage of time, the person accused of killing her was also growing older. The family could not simply close the chapter. They did not have that luxury. In 2003, 2 years after Amanda's death, her father spoke about his frustration with the investigation. He said investigators continued calling, but the updates were painful because they seemed to bring no resolution. The case had not been forgotten, but it had not been solved. That difference can destroy a family slowly. There is no courtroom, no verdict, no sentence. Only questions. Why her? Why inside her barracks? Who was there? Who knew? Who stayed silent? The Army eventually offered a substantial reward for information. By 2008, investigators were offering $100,000 for information leading to the apprehension and conviction of the person or persons responsible. The public appeal was extraordinary. It was an admission that after years of investigation, authorities still needed someone to come forward. But silence has a strange power in cold cases. People convince themselves that too much time has passed. They believe the truth no longer matters. They assume investigators have moved on. They think evidence has disappeared. But homicide investigators often understand something different. Time can destroy evidence. Time can also create distance. And sometimes distance makes people talk. A person who once feared consequences may become less afraid. A person who once protected someone may become angry. A relationship may collapse. A secret may become too heavy to carry. That possibility kept Amanda's case alive. And investigators did not simply wait. Army CID continued to preserve and review cold cases. The investigation involved American and German authorities. Years later, the FBI will become heavily involved as the case moved toward federal prosecution. The technology changed. The investigative methods changed. The people changed. But Amanda's name remained. Then came a development that would change the direction of the entire investigation. Shannon Wilkerson had been serving in the Army at the time of Amanda's death. He was not merely someone who might have existed somewhere near the same city. He was part of the military community surrounding the victim. According to prosecutors, Wilkerson feared that he might be the father of Amanda's unborn child. And prosecutors later argued that the pregnancy created a threat to his own life. He was married to another soldier. He had a military career. And, according to the government's case, he believed Amanda's pregnancy could destroy both. That theory would become the heart of the prosecution. But in a cold case, theory is not enough. Investigators needed evidence connecting Wilkerson to Amanda's death. They needed to establish opportunity. They needed to establish motive. They needed to reconstruct the timeline. And they needed to explain why a murder committed in Germany in 2001 could still be prosecuted in the United States more than 2 decades later. The legal mechanism was the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act. It gave federal courts jurisdiction over certain crimes committed overseas by members or former members of the U.S. Armed Forces. That meant the case could travel. Germany had been the location of the murder. Florida became the location of the prosecution. The distance between them represented 22 years of investigation. When Wilkerson was arrested in 2023, the case immediately drew national attention. A former soldier was accused of murdering another soldier. A pregnant 19-year-old had been found dead inside her barracks room. And the man authorities now accused of killing her had spent years living outside the shadow of the case. He had built a life after the murder. Amanda never had the chance. For the first time, her family could look at a courtroom and imagine a verdict. But before that could happen, prosecutors had to take the jury back to Germany. Back to November 2001. Back to Fliegerhorst-Kaserne. Back to the room where Amanda's life ended. And back to the question that had haunted investigators for 22 years. What happened behind that door? The most powerful evidence in a cold case is often not one dramatic discovery. It is the accumulation of small facts, a statement, a timeline, a relationship, a contradiction, a memory, a piece of physical evidence that becomes more meaningful when placed beside something investigators already knew. The prosecution's case against Shannon Wilkerson would rely on that accumulation. According to federal prosecutors, Amanda was not randomly selected. They argued that the relationship between Amanda and Wilkerson provided the motive. Amanda was pregnant. Wilkerson believed he might be the father, and prosecutors said he feared the consequences. The government alleged that the pregnancy threatened his marriage and his military career. That was a theory. But the courtroom would require more than a theory. The defense had the right to challenge every part of it. After 22 years, memories could be questioned. Witness recollections could be challenged. Investigative decisions made in 2001 could be scrutinized. And the government had to convince 12 jurors that Wilkerson was responsible for Amanda's death. The case, therefore, became a reconstruction of the past. The jury had to imagine a place they could not physically return to. Fliegerhorst-Kaserne was no longer the same military environment. Time had changed everything. But the evidence was designed to make the past visible again. Amanda's body had been found in her third-floor barracks room after she failed to report for work. Her death had been ruled a homicide by asphyxiation. The evidence presented at trial established that she had been beaten and strangled. The violence was not accidental. Someone had attacked her. Someone had taken control of her final moments. And then someone had left. For the family, those facts were horrifying enough. But there was another layer. Amanda was only 19. She had been in Germany for about 8 months. She was working. She was building friendships. She had a future. She was pregnant. Every one of those details made the murder more than a statistic. She was a young woman thousands of miles from the place she grew up, surrounded by people who were supposed to be her military community. And then she was gone. The investigation continued for years. In 2015, Army CID publicly renewed the appeal for information and highlighted the $100,000 reward. The message from investigators was unmistakable. The case was still open. Someone still knew something. That public appeal also demonstrated how seriously the Army viewed the murder. The case had survived more than a decade. Then another decade. The passage of time did not erase it. Instead, it became part of the story. Amanda's family had spent years carrying the uncertainty. Her biological father died in 2021 before he could see an arrest in his daughter's case. That detail would make the eventual breakthrough even more painful. For some family members, justice came too late for the people who had spent the longest waiting for it. Then, in February 2023, the phone rang. Federal investigators had arrested Wilkerson. 22 years after Amanda's death, the case had finally reached a new stage. But there was no guarantee of conviction. Wilkerson pleaded not guilty. The accusation was now formal. The government had made its case public. The defense would fight it, and the past would be tested in court. The arrest also revealed the unusual path the investigation had taken. A murder that occurred on a U.S. military installation in Germany had become a federal case in the United States. Investigators from the Army had originally handled the case. The FBI later became involved. German law enforcement partners assisted. The case crossed jurisdictions because the victim was an American soldier and the accused was a former member of the U.S. Armed Forces. It was not a simple local homicide investigation. It was an international cold case. And every year that passed made the challenge more difficult. Yet the investigation continued. The fact that authorities eventually brought Wilkerson before a federal judge demonstrated that investigators believed the evidence had become strong enough to support prosecution. That did not erase the years of uncertainty. It did not give Amanda back. It did not answer every question the family had carried. But it changed one thing. The name of the suspected killer was no longer only part of an investigative file. It was now written into a federal indictment. The case had entered the courtroom, and the courtroom would force the government to tell the story of Amanda Gonzalez from beginning to end, not as a rumor, not as a theory, not as a family suspicion, but as evidence. The trial became the moment when 22 years of investigation collided with the rules of federal court. In May 2024, a federal jury in Pensacola, Florida, heard the case. The location itself was striking. Amanda had been killed in Germany. Her family had waited in Texas. The investigation had involved Army CID and the FBI. And now, thousands of miles from the original crime scene, a jury in Florida would decide whether Shannon Wilkerson was guilty. The prosecution presented the murder as a result of fear. According to evidence introduced at trial, Wilkerson believed he might be the father of Amanda's unborn child. The government argued that he feared the consequences of Amanda's pregnancy. He was married to another soldier. He had a military career. And prosecutors argued that Amanda's pregnancy threatened both. The alleged motive was therefore deeply personal. It was not presented as a random attack. It was presented as a murder committed to eliminate a problem. But the victim was not a problem. She was a 19-year-old woman. She was a soldier. She was a daughter. And she was carrying a child. The prosecution alleged that Wilkerson beat and strangled her in her barracks room. The brutality of the attack became part of the evidence. This was not a death caused by a single moment of panic, according to the government's case. It was an assault, a violent confrontation, and then silence. For the jury, the central question was whether the evidence proved that Wilkerson was the person responsible. The defense challenged the government's case. More than 20 years had passed. That alone created difficulties. Witnesses remembered events from 2001. Investigators had to explain old evidence. The jury had to evaluate information created under circumstances that existed before smartphones, modern digital forensics, and investigative technologies common today. But the government had something else. Time had not erased the case completely. Investigators had kept working. The FBI and Army CID continued reviewing the murder. The international nature of the investigation meant that American and German authorities had to work together. That cooperation became important as the case moved forward. The Army later described the investigation as an example of how cold cases can remain active even after logical investigative leads appear exhausted. Cold does not mean forgotten. It means unresolved. And Amanda's case had remained unresolved for years, until the evidence eventually pointed toward Wilkerson strongly enough for prosecutors to act. The trial lasted long enough for jurors to confront the entire history of the case. They heard about Amanda. They heard about the murder. They heard about the pregnancy. They heard about Wilkerson. They heard about the investigation. And they heard about the years of silence that followed. The defense had its opportunity to challenge the government's narrative. That is one of the defining features of a criminal trial. An accusation is not proof. An arrest is not guilt. A theory is not a verdict. The prosecution had to cross that final distance. Beyond a reasonable doubt. Then came May 6, 2024. The jury reached its decision. Shannon L. Wilkerson was found guilty of second-degree murder. 22 years after Amanda Gonzalez was killed, a jury finally declared the man responsible. The verdict was a moment that Amanda's family had spent decades waiting to hear. But it was also a painful reminder of how much had been lost. Amanda was still 19. Her unborn child was still unborn. Her father was still gone. Her family had aged without her. And the man convicted of killing her had lived through more than 2 decades that Amanda never received. The courtroom had delivered an answer, but it could not undo time. It could not reopen the barracks door. It could not restore the young woman who had left Texas for Germany believing she was beginning a future. The verdict could only establish responsibility under the law. And even then, one final stage remained. Sentencing. The government had secured the conviction. Now the court would determine the punishment. Wilkerson faced the possibility of life imprisonment under the federal murder statute, but the final sentence would depend on the court and the applicable sentencing factors. For Amanda's family, the question had changed. For 22 years, they had asked, who killed Amanda? Now they could ask, how many years will he serve? That question would be answered later that year. And when it was, the number would carry the weight of everything that had happened since November 2001. On October 24th, 2024, the final major chapter of the federal prosecution arrived. Shannon L. Wilkerson was sentenced to 30 years in prison for Amanda Gonzalez's murder. The sentence brought a legal conclusion to a case that had begun more than 22 years earlier inside a military barracks in Germany. 30 years. A number that cannot measure a human life. Amanda was 19 when she died. If she had lived, she would have been in her 40s when Wilkerson was sentenced. She would have watched the world change. She might have left the army. She might have gone to college. She might have become the person she had hoped to become. She might have raised children. She might have grown old. All of those possibilities ended in one room in November 2001. The sentencing, therefore, did something that the verdict alone could not. It placed a legal consequence at the end of a 22-year timeline. The accused became a convicted murderer. The cold case became a closed prosecution. And Amanda's name returned to public record not only as a victim, but as the center of an investigation that refused to die. Yet the story remains disturbing because of what happened before the arrest. For years, there was no certainty. The family had no courtroom. There was no sentence. There was only an empty place where Amanda should have been. The Army continued investigating. The FBI later became involved. German law enforcement assisted. Investigators reviewed the case. And eventually, evidence was presented that prosecutors said connected Wilkerson to the murder. The case became an example of one of the most difficult realities in criminal investigation. Justice does not always move at the speed of grief. A family can spend 20 years waiting while a case moves slowly through evidence, jurisdiction, technology, and human memory. For Amanda's relatives, 22 years was not an abstract number. It was every Thanksgiving without her, every Christmas without her, every birthday, every family gathering, every time someone asked what happened, every time they had to explain that the person who killed her had never been caught. And then, suddenly, The arrest in 2023 came decades after the murder. The conviction came in 2024. The sentence followed months later. The investigation that had once appeared frozen was suddenly moving quickly. That transformation is one of the most striking elements of Amanda's story. A cold case can look dead from the outside. But inside law enforcement agencies, old files can remain alive. Evidence can be preserved. Names can be checked again. Witness statements can be revisited. Technology can provide new opportunities. And investigators can decide that an unanswered murder deserves another look. Amanda's case demonstrates that passage of time does not necessarily mean the disappearance of justice, but it also shows the cost of delay. Her biological father died in 2021. He never saw the arrest. He never saw the verdict. He never saw the sentence. For him, justice arrived after his own life had ended. That is one of the cruelest facts in the story. The people who waited the longest are not always alive when the answer finally comes. But the answer came. And the military community that once knew Amanda could finally attach a name to the crime. Shannon Wilkerson, former soldier, convicted murderer, 30-year federal sentence. The case was no longer a mystery in the eyes of the law, but the emotional questions remained. Why did Amanda have to die? Why did her pregnancy become a source of fear instead of a reason for protection? Why did it take 22 years? Could the case have been solved earlier? Those questions belong to a different category. A criminal court can determine guilt. It cannot rewrite history. It cannot return a victim to her family. It cannot give back the years. It can only establish what happened according to the evidence and impose a legal consequence. For Amanda Gonzalez, that consequence came decades later. But her name had survived. There is a particular silence that surrounds old military bases after they close. Buildings remain. Hallways remain. Empty rooms remain. But the people are gone. Fliegerhorst Kaserne, once part of the American military presence in Germany, eventually became part of history. Amanda's barracks room no longer functions as the center of an active Army investigation. The soldiers who lived there moved on. The commanders changed. The investigators changed. The uniforms changed. The years passed. But November 2001 remains fixed. Amanda was 19. She was pregnant. She was a soldier. And she died inside the place where she lived. For the people who knew her, that fact can never become ordinary. In the years when the case was unsolved, the murder became a cold case. That phrase can sound clinical. Cold case. 2 words. But behind those words was a family waiting. Behind them was a mother grieving. Behind them was a father making calls. Behind them were photographs of a young woman who would never grow older. Behind them was a military investigation that refused to disappear. And behind them was a question. Who did this? When Wilkerson was arrested in 2023, that question finally had a legal answer. But the case had already become larger than the identity of one suspect. It became a story about memory, about military life, about young soldiers far from home, about the difficulty of investigating crimes across borders, about evidence surviving decades, about families who refuse to stop asking, and about the strange way time behaves in homicide cases. For the victim, time stops. For everyone else, it continues. That contrast can be unbearable. Amanda remained 19. Her classmates became adults. Her relatives grew older. The soldiers around her changed careers. The accused grew older. Investigators retired. New investigators took their place. Technology advanced. And eventually, the case moved again. The federal prosecution brought together the past and the present. The government presented evidence from a murder that had happened in a world that barely resembled the world of the trial. The jury had to look backward. The judge had to look backward. The family had spent decades looking backward. Only Amanda could never move forward. That is what makes cold cases so haunting. They are not simply mysteries waiting for an answer. They are unfinished lives. And sometimes the answer arrives so late that it feels almost unreal. For Amanda's family, however, late justice was still justice. The verdict mattered. The sentence mattered. The conviction created an official record of responsibility. The 30-year sentence ensured that the man convicted of killing Amanda would spend a substantial portion of his remaining life in federal prison. And perhaps most importantly, Amanda's case was no longer a question mark. Her name no longer appeared beside the words "unsolved murder." It became part of a completed federal prosecution. That distinction matters, because for more than 2 decades, Amanda's family had to live with uncertainty. Now there was certainty. The tragedy did not disappear, but uncertainty did. The unanswered phone calls stopped being unanswered in the same way. The reward no longer represented an open search for an unknown killer. The investigation no longer depended on someone finally stepping forward. The courtroom had spoken. Still, there's a final image that remains. A 19-year-old soldier arriving in Germany, far from home. A young woman beginning what should have been a long life. A barracks room. A November day. A door. Then silence. 2 days later, soldiers discover the truth. For 22 years, that truth had no final name. Then an arrest came. Then a trial. Then a conviction. Then a sentence. But none of those words can change the first fact. Amanda Gonzalez should have lived. Her unborn child should have had a future. Her family should never have had to wait 22 years for an answer. And yet they did. That is a haunting legacy of the Amanda Gonzalez case. Not simply that a young soldier was murdered. Not simply that the investigation lasted more than 2 decades. But that an entire generation of people had to carry the weight of a question that refused to disappear. Until finally, in a federal courtroom in Florida, the question became a verdict. And the verdict became a sentence. 30 years. 22 years after murder. A lifetime after Amanda's final morning. The Barretts are quiet now. The investigation is no longer searching for a name. The case is no longer waiting for an arrest. But somewhere in a record of that old military installation, one name remains impossible to erase. Amanda Gonzalez, 19 years old, soldier, daughter, mother-to-be, murder victim. And after 22 years of uncertainty, a woman whose death finally received an answer in court. The years could not bring her back. They could not restore what was taken. But they could not erase her either. Because some cases survive precisely because someone refuses to let the victim disappear. And Amanda Gonzalez was never forgotten. The answer had finally arrived. But for the people who had lived with a question for 22 years, an answer could never be the same thing as closure. Because closure suggests an ending. Amanda Gonzalez never had one. Her life ended in 2001, but the investigation continued long after the crime scene disappeared from public view. The people who knew her carried fragments of that November with them. A face, a voice, a uniform, a hallway, a conversation. A name that might once have seemed ordinary, but would later become impossible to hear without remembering the murder. For investigators, the case had another problem. Memory is fragile. People remember what they saw. They also remember what they believe they saw. And after 20 years, those two things can become difficult to separate. That is why cold case investigations are so demanding. Detectives are not simply looking for a killer. They are reconstructing an entire world that no longer exists. In Amanda's case, that world was the U.S. military community in Hanau, Germany. Young soldiers lived there. They worked together. They ate together. They trained together. They formed relationships far from their families. Some relationships were casual. Others became intimate. Some lasted only months. Amanda had been in Germany for roughly 8 months. That meant her world was still relatively new, but she had already become part of the community. She had a job. She had people who knew her. She had a room. And she had a private life that investigators would eventually have to examine in extraordinary detail. Because when a person is murdered, investigators do not simply ask what happened on the day of death. They ask what happened before it. Who spoke to the victim? Who called her? Who argued with her? Who wanted something from her? Who feared something she knew? Who could enter her room? Who knew her schedule? Who knew she was pregnant? And perhaps most importantly, who had a reason to believe that Amanda's death would solve the problem? That question became central to the prosecution's case against Wilkerson. According to the government, the pregnancy was not an incidental detail. It was a motive. Amanda was carrying a child. Wilkerson allegedly believed the child could be his. And prosecutors argued that this possibility created fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of consequences. Fear that his marriage could collapse. Fear that his military career could be affected. The prosecution's theory was devastatingly simple. If Amanda disappeared, the problem disappeared with her. But Amanda did not disappear quietly. Her absence was noticed. She failed to report for work. People became concerned. Her room was checked. And the terrible truth was discovered. She was dead. The investigation began almost immediately. The room became a crime scene. The ordinary details of military life were suddenly transformed into evidence. A place where someone had slept became a place where someone had died. A hallway became a possible route. A schedule became a timeline. A relationship became a potential motive. And every person who had been near Amanda became part of the investigation. Yet no arrest came. That is the part of the story that can be difficult to understand decades later. How could someone be murdered inside a military installation and the killer remain unidentified? The answer lies in the complexity of real investigations. There is rarely one perfect clue. There may be dozens of pieces of information, but none of them individually provides the answer. A witness may remember a person, but not the exact time. A timeline may suggest an opportunity, but not prove action. A motive may be obvious, but still fail to establish identity. And when investigators cannot connect those pieces beyond the required legal standard, the case remains open. Amanda's case became one of those investigations. The years accumulated. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 15. And then 20. The number itself became shocking. 20 years. Amanda's murder was old enough to belong to another era. The soldiers who had been young adults in 2001 were now middle-aged. The world had changed. Technology had changed. Investigative techniques had changed. But the basic question remained exactly where it had been on the first night. Who killed Amanda Gonzalez? Then came 2021. Amanda's biological father, Santos T.C. Gonzalez, died. He had spent years waiting for justice for his daughter. He would not live to see the arrest. He would not sit through the trial. He would not hear the verdict. He would not hear the sentence. That fact would later become one of the most painful elements surrounding the case. Because for families of murder victims, justice is often imagined as a moment, a courtroom, a verdict, a sentence. But the reality is that justice is also a timeline, and that timeline can move much slower than human life. Parents can die. Witnesses can die. Friends can disappear. Investigators can retire. Evidence can become harder to interpret. The victim's family can become exhausted from waiting. Still, the case remained. Then, in 2023, the silence broke. Federal agents arrested Shannon L. Wilkerson in Florida. The distance between Germany and Florida suddenly became a symbol of the investigation itself. Amanda had died in Europe. Wilkerson had eventually built a life in the United States. 22 years separated the alleged crime from the arrest. 22 years of ordinary life for the accused. 22 years of extraordinary grief for Amanda's family. The arrest immediately transformed the story. For the first time, there was a defendant. There was a federal indictment. There was a courtroom. There was a prosecutor preparing to present evidence. And there was a defense preparing to challenge it. Wilkerson was no longer simply a name investigators had examined. He was facing the full power of the federal criminal justice system. The government charged him with first-degree murder. The case would ultimately proceed to trial. But the arrest also raised a difficult question. Why did it take so long? Cold case arrests often create the illusion that investigators suddenly discovered everything. Usually, that is not what happens. More often, investigators spend years accumulating information until one piece becomes significant enough to change the meaning of everything around it. A clue that once appeared weak may become powerful when combined with later evidence. A witness may remember something differently. An investigator may revisit an old interview. A technological development may allow authorities to examine evidence in a new way. A case can remain dormant without ever truly being dead. Amanda's case illustrates that reality. For years, the investigation remained open. Then the federal government decided it had enough evidence to bring Wilkerson to court. The legal battle that followed would be fundamentally different from the investigation that came before it. In an investigation, detectives can pursue possibilities. In court, prosecutors must prove facts. That difference is enormous. The government could tell the jury that Wilkerson had a motive. It could explain his connection to Amanda. It could describe the pregnancy. It could reconstruct the circumstances surrounding her death. But at the end, 12 jurors had to answer one question. Was the evidence strong enough to prove that Shannon Wilkerson was responsible for Amanda Gonzalez's murder? The courtroom, therefore, became the final battlefield. Not a military base. Not a German barracks. Not an interrogation room. A federal courtroom in Florida. And in that courtroom, the past would be reconstructed one piece at a time. The prosecution would bring Amanda back through photographs, testimony, records, and evidence. Not physically. That was impossible. But through the memories and facts preserved since 2001, the jury would hear about a 19-year-old soldier whose life ended violently. They would hear about a pregnancy that prosecutors said was central to the motive. They would hear about the man accused of killing her. And they would hear about an investigation that refused to disappear. For Amanda's family, this was the moment they had waited for. But waiting for a trial is different from waiting for an arrest. An arrest creates hope. A trial creates uncertainty again. Because the government could lose. Evidence could be challenged. Witnesses could be discredited. The jury could reject the prosecution's theory. A cold case can survive 22 years only to collapse in the courtroom. That possibility remained until the jury returned its verdict. And when that verdict finally came, the decades of uncertainty changed forever. Wilkerson was found guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict did not say Amanda had finally been found. She had never been lost. Her family had always known where she was. The verdict said something else. It established legal responsibility for her death. For more than 2 decades, Amanda's name had been attached to an unanswered question. Now it was attached to a conviction. But even that moment could not erase the years before it. Amanda's family had lived through a generation of uncertainty. Her father had died before justice arrived. Friends had grown older. The military community that surrounded her in 2001 had scattered. And the place where she died had become part of history. That is the strange cruelty of time in a murder case. The investigation can eventually reach the truth, but it cannot make the victim younger. It cannot reverse the calendar. It cannot return the years that were stolen. The courtroom can only decide what happened. It cannot change what happened. And so, after the verdict, the final question became punishment. How should 22 years of uncertainty end? The answer came on October 24th, 2024. Wilkerson was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. 30 years. A sentence that will extend deep into the future. A sentence that will become another date in the timeline of the case. But the most important dates remain the ones connected to Amanda. November 2001, the day she was killed. February 2023, the day Wilkerson was arrested. May 2024, the day the jury found him guilty. October 2024, the day the sentence was imposed. 4 dates. 1 life. 22 years between murder and arrest, and an entire family forced to live inside that gap. The case is no longer unsolved. The investigation is no longer searching for the person responsible. The federal court has issued its judgment. But the haunting question is not simply who killed Amanda. It is what kind of life she might have lived if that November night had never happened. That question has no courtroom answer. No forensic test can solve it. No witness can testify about it. No prosecutor can prove it, because the future Amanda should have had disappeared with her. And that is why the story remains disturbing even after the conviction. Justice arrived. But it arrived late. Very late. The world moved forward while Amanda remained 19. Her family grew older while her photograph remained frozen in time. The military changed. Germany changed. America changed. Investigations changed. Technology changed. But Amanda's final chapter remained the same until a federal jury finally wrote another sentence into the record. Guilty. For 22 years, that word did not exist. Now it does. And somewhere beneath the legal language, the federal statutes, the investigative reports, the courtroom testimony, and the sentencing documents, there remains a much simpler truth. A young woman went to Germany as a soldier. She was 19. She was pregnant. She had a future. Then she was murdered. For years, no one could tell her family who had done it. Now they can. The answer cannot bring Amanda back, but it can ensure that her death is not remembered as an anonymous cold case forever. Her name is Amanda Gonzalez. And after 22 years, the silence surrounding her murder finally had a voice. There was a reason Amanda Gonzalez's murder refused to disappear. It was not simply because the victim was young. It was not simply because she was a soldier. And it was not simply because the killing happened thousands of miles from the United States. It was because the crime had taken place inside a world built around discipline, routine, and accountability. A military base. A place where people were expected to know where they were supposed to be. A place where schedules mattered. A place where names were recorded. A place where soldiers lived among other soldiers. And yet, somehow, a 19-year-old woman could be beaten and strangled inside her own barracks room, and the person responsible could walk away without being arrested for more than 2 decades. That contradiction would haunt the investigation. Amanda had been assigned to Fliegerhorst Kaserne near Hanau, Germany. She was serving with Headquarters Supply Company, 127th Aviation Support Battalion. Working as a cook, she had arrived in Germany only about 8 months before her death. For a young soldier, that was a short time. She was still adjusting to a foreign country, still learning the rhythm of military life, still building a circle of people she trusted. And somewhere inside that new life, Amanda had become pregnant. For months. That pregnancy would later become one of the most important elements of the prosecution's case. But in the beginning, investigators were looking at something much simpler. A missing soldier. Amanda did not report for work. At first, that absence may not have seemed catastrophic. People miss appointments. People oversleep. People become sick. But Amanda's absence continued. Concern grew. Eventually, soldiers went to her third-floor barracks room. And then everything changed. The body of Private First Class Amanda Gonzalez was discovered on November 5th, 2001. She had been dead for approximately 2 days, according to the established timeline of the case. The room was no longer a place where a young soldier lived. It was a crime scene. Investigators entered. They documented. They searched. They examined. And what they were looking at was not an accident. Amanda had been beaten. She had been strangled. Her death was classified as a homicide by asphyxiation. There was no ambiguity about the violence. Someone had attacked her. Someone had killed her. And someone had left the room. That final fact created the central mystery. How? How could someone commit such a violent crime inside a military installation and then disappear? Was the killer a stranger? Was it someone Amanda knew? Was the person familiar with her schedule? Did the killer know she was pregnant? Did the killer enter her room by invitation? Or had Amanda opened the door for someone she never imagined would become a threat? Every possibility had to be examined. Every person who had crossed Amanda's path had to be considered. And investigators had to work with a terrible limitation. Amanda could not tell them what happened. Her voice had disappeared with her. So investigators had to speak for her through evidence. The first challenge was reconstructing her final days. Who had seen her? Who had spoken with her? Who had been close to her? Who knew about the pregnancy? Who knew about the father of the child? And who might have feared what would happen if that pregnancy became impossible to hide? These questions became increasingly important as the investigation developed. At some point, investigators focused on Shannon L. Wilkerson. He was another member of the U.S. military. He was not an anonymous civilian somewhere outside the base. He was part of the same military environment. According to prosecutors, Wilkerson believed he might be the father of Amanda's unborn child. And that belief, prosecutors later argued, gave him a motive. The government's theory was that Amanda's pregnancy threatened his marriage and his military career. It was a theory of fear. A young soldier carrying a pregnancy. A man who believed he might be responsible. A marriage that could be threatened. A military career that could be damaged. And a secret that could become public. But suspicion is not enough. In a murder investigation, investigators can suspect someone for years. A prosecutor cannot send a person to prison on suspicion. The evidence must establish responsibility. That distinction would become critical because the case would not reach a courtroom for another 22 years. During those 22 years, investigators had to live with uncertainty. The Army Criminal Investigation Command kept the case active. Eventually, authorities offered substantial reward for information. By 2008, the reward had been increased to $100,000. Later Army records referred to the continuing effort to identify the person responsible for Amanda's murder. The public message was direct. Someone knew something. Investigators believed there was information somewhere that could break the case open. Perhaps a person had seen something in the barracks. Perhaps someone had heard a conversation. Perhaps someone knew about Amanda's relationship with Wilkerson. Perhaps someone had been told something after the murder. And perhaps that person had carried the secret for years. The investigators waited. But no breakthrough came quickly. The military community changed. Soldiers were reassigned. People left Germany. Some returned to the United States. Others left military service entirely. The physical world of the investigation changed too. The base that had once been filled with American soldiers eventually became part of the past. But Amanda's case remained. A file, a photograph, a name, a date, a murder, and an unanswered question. The passage of time created another problem. People began forgetting details. A witness who had been 20 years old in 2001 might be 40 years old when investigators contacted them again. A person who had once remembered a hallway conversation might now remember only fragments. A soldier who once knew Amanda might have moved thousands of miles away. Relationships had changed. Marriages had changed. Careers had changed. Some people had died. And yet investigators continued. Because cold cases do not follow the normal rules of time. A murder does not become less important simply because it becomes older. The victim does not become less dead. The family does not stop grieving. And the unanswered question does not become less painful. For Amanda's family, the years became a second tragedy. The first tragedy was losing Amanda. The second was losing the possibility of knowing why. Her biological father, Santos T.C. Gonzalez, continued waiting. He wanted answers. He wanted to know who had taken his daughter's life. He wanted the person responsible held accountable. But years passed, then decades, and the family remained trapped in the space between hope and despair. Every public appeal carried the same promise. Maybe someone would finally talk. Maybe someone would finally remember. Maybe someone would finally decide that protecting a secret was no longer worth the cost. But silence remained. Then, something unexpected happened. The world changed. Technology changed. Investigative techniques changed. The agencies involved changed. And old evidence could be viewed through new eyes. This is where cold case investigations become different from ordinary investigations. A detective investigating a recent murder works forward. A cold case detective works backward. The final event is already known. The victim is already dead. The crime scene has already been processed. The witnesses have already gone home. The question is not what happened after the murder. The question is what was missed before it. What connection was overlooked? What statement was misunderstood? What detail was dismissed? What relationship was not fully understood? And what information, buried somewhere in decades of records, could suddenly become important? Amanda's case eventually became exactly that kind of investigation. The Army CID continued reviewing cold cases. The FBI became involved. German authorities assisted. The investigation became an international law enforcement effort. That cooperation would eventually prove critical. Because Amanda had been murdered in Germany, but the man accused of killing her was no longer living under the jurisdiction of the military system that existed when the crime happened. Wilkerson had eventually been discharged from the Army. That created a legal complication. How could the United States prosecute a former service member for a murder committed overseas decades earlier? The answer came through federal law. The Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act. The statute gives federal courts jurisdiction over certain crimes committed outside the United States by members or former members of the U.S. Armed Forces. That legal framework became essential. The crime had happened overseas. The victim was an American soldier. The accused had been a member of the U.S. Armed Forces. And now, more than 2 decades later, federal prosecutors had a path forward. But before there could be a trial, there had to be an arrest. That moment came on February 23rd, 2023. Federal authorities arrested Shannon L. Wilkerson in the Northern District of Florida. The cold case was suddenly no longer just an old investigation. It was a federal prosecution. Wilkerson was charged with first-degree murder. The alleged crime had occurred more than 21 years earlier. The world had changed dramatically since Amanda's death. In 2001, Amanda had been 19. In 2023, the man accused of killing her was 42. 22 years had transformed both of their stories. Amanda's ended in a barracks room. Wilkerson's continued through decades of ordinary life until federal agents arrived. The arrest created a moment of shock. For investigators, it was the culmination of years of work. For Amanda's family, it was something they had almost stopped believing they would see. But an arrest is not justice. It is the beginning of another test. The government now had to prove its case, and the defense had the right to challenge every allegation. The courtroom would not care that the case had taken 22 years. It would not care that the family had waited. It would not care that the murder was horrific. The jury would have to evaluate evidence. Beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard would determine everything. The prosecution, therefore, had to rebuild Amanda's final days. They had to explain why Wilkerson was allegedly connected to her. They had to explain the pregnancy. They had to explain the alleged motive. They had to establish what happened inside the barracks room. And they had to persuade jurors that the person standing before them was responsible for the murder committed in Germany more than 2 decades earlier. The defense, meanwhile, could challenge the government's reconstruction. Every witness, every timeline, every inference, every piece of evidence. That is what makes a courtroom different from a documentary. The audience can feel certainty. The jury cannot. The jury must decide based on evidence admitted in court. And that evidence had to survive scrutiny. The case eventually went to trial in Pensacola, Florida, a place far removed from the German barracks where Amanda had died. But geography could not erase history. The courtroom became a bridge between 2 worlds. Germany, 2001. Florida, 2024. Amanda's final days were transported across the Atlantic through testimony and evidence. The prosecution told jurors that Wilkerson had a motive. He believed he might be the father of Amanda's unborn child. And prosecutors argued that he feared the consequences of that pregnancy. The government described the alleged killing as deliberate violence intended to eliminate a threat. But the jury had to determine whether that story was proven. And for the first time in 22 years, the question surrounding Amanda's death was no longer being asked only by detectives. It was being asked by 12 strangers sitting in judgment. Was Shannon Wilkerson the man who entered Amanda Gonzalez's room on November 3rd, 2001? Was he the man who attacked her? Was he the man who strangled her? Was he the man who walked away while a 19-year-old soldier lay dying? And if the prosecution was right, how had he managed to live for more than 2 decades while Amanda's family carried the consequences of that night? The jury listened. The evidence accumulated. The old case became new again. And somewhere in the courtroom, beneath the legal arguments and the formal language, there remained the image that had started everything. A young soldier who failed to show up for work. A room on the 3rd floor. A discovery that would change a family forever. And a murder investigation that would survive long enough to outlive the very world in which it began. 22 years had passed. But the question was still there. Who killed Amanda Gonzalez? This time, however, the question had finally reached a place where an answer could become permanent. A federal jury. A verdict. And the weight of a decision that could not be undone by another 20 years of silence. The jury had heard the story of Amanda Gonzalez from the beginning. They had heard about the young soldier. They had heard about Germany. They had heard about the pregnancy. They had heard about the barracks room. And they had heard the accusation that a fellow soldier had decided that Amanda had become a threat to the life he wanted to protect. But now came the part that every murder trial eventually reaches. The evidence had to speak for itself. The government could tell the jury what it believed happened. The defense could tell them why they should doubt it. But neither side could control the final decision. That belonged to the jury. Inside the federal courtroom in Pensacola, the murder of a 19-year-old soldier committed more than 2 decades earlier was no longer an old military mystery. It was a criminal case, and every detail mattered. The prosecution's theory centered on motive. Amanda was pregnant. Wilkerson believed he could be the father. According to prosecutors, that possibility created a threat to his marriage and his military career. The government argued that Amanda's pregnancy could expose a relationship and create consequences that Wilkerson desperately wanted to avoid. The alleged solution was horrifying. Amanda had to disappear, but she did not disappear. She was found dead, and her death left behind a trail of questions that investigators would spend years trying to answer. For the jury, the challenge was to determine whether those questions could be connected to Wilkerson beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard is intentionally demanding. A person cannot be convicted simply because investigators believe he is capable of committing a crime. A person cannot be convicted simply because he had a possible motive. And a person cannot be convicted simply because his name appeared somewhere in an old investigation. The government needed to establish responsibility. That meant reconstructing the circumstances around November 3rd, 2001. The timeline was more than a collection of dates. It was a skeleton of the prosecution's case. Amanda was alive. Then she was attacked. Then she was dead. Somewhere between those points was the person responsible. Investigators had spent years trying to identify that person. And the longer the case remained unsolved, the more important the reconstruction became. 22 years can create enormous gaps in memory. But 22 years can also create an enormous amount of documentation. Military records, personnel records, investigative files, statements, reports, photographs, names, relationships. The past does not always disappear. Sometimes it becomes buried, and investigators have to dig. That process eventually led authorities back to Wilkerson. He had been in the military environment surrounding Amanda. He knew the world she lived in. And prosecutors argued that he had a personal reason to fear what Amanda's pregnancy could reveal. The defense, however, had another responsibility: to challenge the government's interpretation of that evidence. A motive is not the same thing as proof. A relationship is not the same thing as murder. A person can fear consequences without becoming a killer. The defense could force jurors to separate suspicion from certainty. That is the heart of a criminal trial. And that distinction was particularly important in a case this old, because the prosecution was asking jurors to travel back to a different century. To imagine a military base in Germany in 2001. To imagine young soldiers living thousands of miles from home. To imagine the routines of the barracks. To imagine Amanda's final hours. And then to imagine what happened after she was killed. That is difficult even when a murder occurs yesterday. After 22 years, it becomes something else entirely. A reconstruction. A forensic puzzle. A story assembled from fragments. And the jury had to decide whether those fragments formed a complete picture. The government presented Wilkerson as the man whose fear of Amanda's pregnancy provided the motive for murder. The prosecution argued that he was not a random suspect. He was connected to Amanda. He was part of her military world. And he had a reason to believe that the pregnancy could have consequences for him. That alleged motive gave the prosecution a narrative. But the prosecution still needed to convince the jury that the narrative was true. That is where the passage of time became both an enemy and a test. A recent murder investigation can rely heavily on fresh memories. A cold case cannot. Instead, investigators have to identify what survived. Sometimes it is a document. Sometimes it is a statement. Sometimes it is a physical object. Sometimes it is a relationship that was documented decades earlier, and sometimes it is simply the fact that people never forget certain moments. Amanda's family never forgot. They could not. The murder became part of their identity. Her father spent years demanding answers. He contacted investigators. He followed developments. He waited for the phone call that might finally tell him the case was moving. But that phone call did not come soon enough. He died in 2021. Then, less than 2 years later, federal authorities arrested Wilkerson. That timing will become one of the most painful elements of the story. The answer arrived. But Amanda's father was no longer alive to hear it. For the remaining family members, the arrest created a mixture of emotions that no courtroom could simplify. Relief, anger, grief, disbelief, and perhaps fear. Because a cold case can become part of a family's daily life. When there is no suspect, there is always uncertainty. When there is an arrest, uncertainty changes shape. Now there is a name. There is a face. There is a defendant. There is a possibility that the person accused could be acquitted. So the family must wait again. The waiting did not end with the arrest. It moved into the courtroom. The trial forced Amanda's relatives to hear details they had spent years trying to understand. The murder was no longer only a family tragedy. It was evidence. Amanda's pregnancy was no longer only a private fact. It became part of the government's theory of motive. Her relationship with Wilkerson was examined. His military service was examined. The events surrounding her final days were examined. Every detail became part of a larger question. What happened inside that room? And why? The answer prosecutors presented was brutally simple. Amanda knew something. Amanda's pregnancy represented something, and Wilkerson allegedly feared the consequences. The government argued that this fear became deadly. The defense did not have to prove an alternative killer. That is another critical feature of criminal law. The defense did not have to identify who else murdered Amanda. It only had to create reasonable doubt about the government's case. That meant every weak link mattered. Every uncertainty mattered. Every unanswered question mattered. And in a case that had remained unsolved for more than 20 years, there were inevitably questions. Could memories be trusted? Could investigators reconstruct the timeline accurately? Could old evidence still support a conviction? Could the jury confidently conclude that Wilkerson was the person responsible? The courtroom became a test of those questions. And outside the courtroom, Amanda's story had already become something much larger. Her name represented one of the Army's long-running cold cases, a murder that had survived through multiple generations of investigators, a case that had once prompted a $100,000 reward, a case that had crossed borders, a case that had eventually reached federal court. The passage of time had not destroyed the investigation. Instead, it had transformed it. The murder began as a military homicide investigation in Germany. It became a cold case. Then it became an FBI investigation. Then it became a federal indictment. And now it was a jury trial. Each stage carried the same question. Who killed Amanda Gonzalez? The prosecution wanted the jury to believe the answer was Shannon Wilkerson. The defense wanted them to doubt that conclusion. And the jury had to listen without allowing the emotion of the case to replace evidence. That was especially difficult because Amanda was only 19. She was younger than many of the people sitting in the courtroom. Her life had barely begun. The photographs presented in connection with the case could not show what she would have become. They could only show who she had been. A young woman, a soldier, a daughter, a woman preparing for motherhood, and then a murder victim. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The courtroom could discuss her death for hours. But Amanda could not speak. She could not explain her final conversation. She could not identify the person who attacked her. She could not describe what happened behind the door. Her family could not ask her. The investigators could not interview her again. The jury had to reconstruct the truth without the one person who knew it completely. That is the cruelest limitation in every homicide case. The victim carries the final answer, and the victim is the one person who cannot deliver it. So the investigators search for other voices, friends, soldiers, records, evidence. And eventually, the prosecution brought the case before a jury. The trial became the culmination of decades of work. But the family was still forced to sit through one more uncertainty. A verdict had not yet arrived. The government had made its case. The defense had challenged it. Now the jury had the responsibility. Outside the courtroom, the case had already generated enormous interest because of its timeline. 22 years. That number alone was shocking. Most people cannot imagine waiting 22 years for an answer to a murder. For Amanda's family, it was not a number. It was a lifetime. It was a difference between 19 and 41. It was a difference between a young woman beginning adulthood and the age she might have reached if she had survived. It was the difference between a father waiting for justice and a father dying before justice arrived. And now the jury had the power to determine whether the final chapter would be conviction or another unanswered question. The courtroom doors closed. The jurors deliberated. And somewhere in those deliberations was the weight of November 2001. The barracks. The pregnancy. The violence. The silence. The years. The investigation. The arrest. Everything had led to this moment. Amanda's family had waited more than 2 decades. Investigators had waited more than 2 decades. The government had finally brought the case to trial. Now 12 people had to decide whether the evidence was enough. Hours passed. The uncertainty returned. Then came the verdict. Shannon L. Wilkerson was found guilty of second-degree murder. For Amanda's family, the words must have carried a force that was impossible to measure. 22 years after the murder, the person prosecuted for her death had been convicted. The cold case had reached its most important turning point. But the courtroom still was not finished. A conviction answers one question. A sentence answers another. How much punishment should follow? That question would remain until October. Until then, the family had something they had not possessed since November 2001. Certainty. The certainty that the federal justice system had found Wilkerson legally responsible for Amanda's death. But certainty does not erase grief. It does not erase the photographs. It does not erase the memories. It does not erase the years when Amanda's family had no idea whether the person responsible was still nearby, living an ordinary life, or had disappeared forever. And it certainly does not restore the 19-year-old woman who should have walked out of that barracks room alive. The verdict closed one door, but behind it remained the most painful reality of all. Amanda was still gone, and nothing the court could do would change that. For 22 years, her family had been waiting for a name. Now they had won, but they had also gained something else. A date. A verdict. A sentence to come. And an official record stating that Amanda Gonzalez's murder was no longer an unsolved mystery. The case had survived long enough to reach the courtroom, and the courtroom had finally spoken. Yet even after the guilty verdict, one thought remained impossible to escape. If investigators had known in 2001 what they knew in 2024, would Amanda's family have had to wait 22 years? No court could answer that. No prosecutor could answer it. No verdict could answer it. It belonged to the unanswered history of the case. And that history would remain. Because the most haunting cold cases are not only about how the killer was eventually caught. They are about how many years passed before anyone could say his name with certainty. Amanda Gonzalez had waited more than 2 decades for that moment. Her family had waited with her memory. And now, finally, the investigation had crossed a line between suspicion and judgment. The name was no longer buried inside an old investigative file. It was spoken in court. Chanonel Wilkerson, guilty. But the final consequence had not yet arrived. The judge still had to decide the sentence. And when that sentence came, the 22-year story of Amanda Gonzalez would reach the final stage of its legal journey. Not an ending, not true closure, but a judgment. A number of years, a prison cell, and the last official answer to a murder that had begun with a silent barracks room in Germany. The sentence would come months after the verdict, but for Amanda's family, the waiting had already become a familiar form of pain. They had waited through years when there was no suspect. They had waited through years when investigators could offer only limited updates. They had waited through the arrest. They had waited through the trial. And now they were waiting for the final punishment. But before that punishment was imposed, there was something else the case had to confront: the passage of time. 22 years is long enough for an entire generation to grow up. It is long enough for children to become parents. It is long enough for military careers to begin and end. It is long enough for people who once shared the same barracks to forget the exact sound of each other's voices. It is long enough for a crime scene to become a memory. And yet Amanda's death remained fixed in the record. November 2001. A 19-year-old soldier. A barracks room. A pregnancy. A murder. For investigators, the challenge had always been to prevent those facts from becoming nothing more than history. A cold case can disappear from public attention without disappearing from law enforcement records. That distinction mattered. Because Amanda's case continued to exist. The Army's investigation had never been formally abandoned. The reward had remained part of the public effort to generate information. The family continued to seek answers. And the agencies involved continued to examine the case. Years after murder, the Army was still publicly asking for information. That persistence mattered because cold cases are often decided by the smallest details. A person remembers a conversation. Someone discovers an old photograph. A relationship is examined again. A former soldier contacts investigators. A detective notices something that earlier investigators could not. One piece may appear insignificant, but combined with everything else, it can become decisive. Amanda's case eventually reached that point. The investigation was no longer simply asking whether someone knew something. It had moved toward identifying a specific suspect. Shannon Wilkerson. He had been in the same military world. He had known Amanda, and prosecutors argued that he had a reason to fear the consequences of her pregnancy. The government did not present the murder as random. It presented it as a calculated act driven by fear. That distinction mattered. A random killing is difficult to predict. A motive-based killing can sometimes be reconstructed through relationships. The closer investigators looked at Amanda's life, the more important those relationships became. She was not living in isolation. She was surrounded by soldiers. People knew her. People knew where she worked. People knew where she lived. Some knew about her personal life. And some may have known about her pregnancy. The pregnancy itself became one of the most disturbing details in the case. Amanda was carrying a child. The child would never be born. The pregnancy therefore became both evidence and tragedy. For her family, it represented another life lost. For prosecutors, it represented the alleged motive. And for the jury, it was one of the facts they had to place inside the larger timeline. The government argued that Wilkerson believed he might be the father. If true, that belief would have placed him in a unique position. He would have had a personal connection to Amanda. He would have had a potential connection to the unborn child. And according to prosecutors, he would have had a reason to fear what Amanda might reveal. But again, motive alone could never be enough. The jury had already considered the evidence. The verdict had already established guilt. Now the case moved into a different phase. Sentencing. The question was no longer whether Wilkerson was responsible. The jury had answered that. The question was how the court would punish him. On October 24th, 2024, the answer came. 30 years in federal prison. 3 decades. A punishment measured in time. The same thing that had defined the investigation. Time. 22 years between Amanda's murder and Wilkerson's arrest. Then 30 years imposed by the court. The numbers were almost impossible to separate from the tragedy. Amanda was 19. Wilkerson was 42 when he was arrested. The sentence would extend his life deep into an age Amanda never reached. But sentencing is not revenge. It is a legal consequence imposed by the court. The sentence created a final boundary around the case. The murder happened in 2001. The investigation continued. The arrest came in 2023. The conviction came in 2024. The sentence came later that same year. And with that, the federal prosecution reached its conclusion. But the case did not become emotionally simple. For Amanda's family, justice had arrived after a devastating delay. Her father had died before the arrest. That fact remained. No verdict could change it. No sentence could change it. The family could celebrate the conviction and still mourn the years that had been lost. Those emotions can exist at the same time. Relief does not cancel grief. Justice does not cancel anger. And a prison sentence does not cancel absence. Amanda remained 19. Her family remained without her. The case was legally resolved. The loss was not. That distinction is important because the language of law can make a case appear cleaner than the reality experienced by a family. Murder. Conviction. Sentence. Closed. But families do not experience homicide as a sequence of legal terms. They experience it as birthdays, empty chairs, photographs, memories, questions from relatives, memories of the victim's voice, and the strange experience of watching the rest of the world continue while one person's life remains frozen. Amanda's family lived through all of that. And for years, they also lived with another fear. The fear that the person responsible might never be identified. That fear finally ended with the arrest. But the investigation had taken so long that many of the people who had been waiting for justice were no longer there. Amanda's father was one of them. That reality gives the case its deepest sense of loss. Justice did not arrive too late for the law. It arrived too late for some of the people who want to see it. Still, investigators kept working. That fact should not be overlooked. Cold cases demand patience. There is no immediate reward. No dramatic arrest in the first 48 hours. No constant media attention. Sometimes years pass with nothing. Then another year. Then another. The case sits in a file while detectives work on other murders. But a good cold case investigation does not mean the victim has been forgotten. It means the question remains open. Amanda's name remained in the system. The murder remained unresolved. And eventually, the investigation reached Wilkerson. That is a part of the story that changes the meaning of the word cold. Cold does not mean dead. Cold does not mean abandoned. Cold means unresolved. And unresolved cases can remain active for years, sometimes decades. The Amanda Gonzalez investigation demonstrates exactly how long that process can take. The original crime scene was in Germany. The eventual prosecution was in Florida. The agencies involved included military investigators and federal authorities. The legal framework crossed international boundaries. The evidence had to survive the passage of time, and the family had survived the waiting. That combination made the case extraordinary. It also explains why the arrest in 2023 mattered so much. For years, the public had known Amanda's name, but the public did not know the final answer. Then federal authorities announced the arrest. The story suddenly moved from who killed Amanda Gonzalez to can the government prove that Wilkerson did it? That was a completely different question. The first belonged to investigators. The second belonged to the courts. And the court ultimately answered it. Guilty. The word is short. The history behind it is not. 22 years. Thousands of miles. Multiple agencies. A family that refused to stop asking. A young woman who never came home. A pregnancy that ended with her life. And a defendant who would eventually receive 30 years in prison. But even after the legal process ended, another question remained. What does justice look like when it comes more than 2 decades after murder? There is no universal answer. For some families, an arrest is enough to bring relief. For others, only a conviction matters. For others, no verdict can ever feel sufficient because the victim will never return. Amanda's family had to live with all of those realities. The conviction mattered. The sentence mattered. But Amanda was still gone. That is why cold case stories rarely end cleanly. The legal case can end. The emotional case continues. A family can spend decades remembering. A community can continue discussing the murder. Investigators can remember the file. And the victim's name can remain alive long after the courtroom has emptied. Amanda's name survived because people kept saying it. Amanda Gonzalez. Not simply the victim. Not simply the pregnant soldier. Not simply the woman killed in Germany. Amanda Gonzalez, a 19-year-old from Texas who joined the military and traveled to Germany. A young woman who was building a life. A daughter whose father spent years demanding answers. A mother-to-be whose child never had the chance to live. Her identity matters because murder can erase a person's future, but it should never erase the person. That is one of the reasons cold case investigations remain important. The victim cannot speak. So someone has to keep speaking her name. For more than 20 years, that responsibility belonged largely to her family and investigators. Eventually, it reached the federal courtroom, and the courtroom gave the story an answer. Wilkerson was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 30 years. The legal record now carries those facts permanently, but the emotional record is different. It contains the unanswered years, the phone calls, the waiting, the anniversaries, the public appeals, the reward, the disappointment, the hope, the arrest, the trial, the verdict, the sentence. Each stage is connected by one person who never had the opportunity to reach the next stage of her own life. Amanda. That is why the final image of this case should not be a courtroom. It should be a young soldier, 19 years old, standing somewhere in Germany before the tragedy. A person who had plans that nobody would ever get to see. A person who believed there would be another day, another week, another year, another birthday. There wasn't. And the fact that it took 22 years to establish responsibility only makes the silence around her death more haunting. For 22 years, the case lived in uncertainty. For 22 years, the person responsible was not behind a federal prison wall. For 22 years, Amanda's family had to wonder whether justice would ever arrive. Then, finally, it did. Not perfectly. Not quickly. Not in the way anyone would have wanted. But it came. The arrest. The conviction. The sentence. 3 legal moments that transformed the case. The first ended uncertainty. The second established responsibility. The third imposed punishment. And yet none of them could change the moment when Amanda's life ended. That moment remains fixed. November 2001. A barracks in Germany. A young soldier who did not report for work. A room that became a crime scene. A family that received the worst possible news. And a mystery that would survive for more than 2 decades. The walls may no longer hold the same people. The uniforms may have changed. The military installation may belong to another chapter of history. But the case remains. Because some crimes become part of the places where they happen. And some victims become part of the memory of the people who refuse to forget them. Amanda Gonzalez became both. Her death became a cold case. Her name became a public appeal. Her family became a voice demanding answers. And eventually, her murder became a federal conviction. That transformation took 22 years. But perhaps the most powerful fact is this. The investigation never stopped asking the question, who killed Amanda Gonzalez? For a long time, nobody could answer. Then one day, after years of silence, investigators finally had a name. And once the name entered the courtroom, the past could no longer hide behind time. The jury heard the evidence. The judge imposed a sentence. The case moved into history. But Amanda's story remains. Not because of the killer. Because of the life that was taken. Because before she became a cold case victim, she was a 19-year-old woman with a future. And that future is the one thing no verdict can ever restore. The courtroom eventually emptied. The microphones were turned off. The attorneys gathered their files. The jurors went home. And the name Amanda Gonzalez returned to the place where it had existed for most of the previous 22 years. The memories of her family. Because after a murder trial ends, the world often moves on quickly. News cameras leave. Headlines disappear from front pages. People begin talking about another case, another arrest, another trial, another tragedy. But for the family of a murder victim, there is no such transition. There is only the return to ordinary life without the person who should still be there. For Amanda's family, that ordinary life had been impossible for more than 2 decades. Her father had spent years searching for answers. He had spoken publicly about the case. He had waited for investigators to call. He had watched the reward increase. He had watched years become decades. And then he died in 2021. 2 years later, the arrest finally came. That sequence is difficult to understand without imagining what those years meant. A father can spend his entire adult life protecting his daughter. Then one day, the daughter is gone, and the father cannot protect her anymore. All he can do is demand that someone answer for what happened. Santos TC, Gonzalez did exactly that. But he did not live long enough to see the person accused of killing Amanda stand before a federal judge. He never saw the jury. He never heard the guilty verdict. He never heard the sentence. The justice he had spent years waiting for arrived after his death. For the family members who remained, that fact could not be separated from the victory of the conviction. It was justice. But it was delayed justice. And delayed justice carries its own kind of sorrow. The investigators who worked the case understood that. They had not forgotten Amanda. The case had survived because someone kept it alive. The Army Criminal Investigation Command had continued to maintain the investigation. The reward had remained a public invitation for information. The FBI eventually became involved, and German authorities remained part of the broader investigative history. The case crossed borders because Amanda's death had occurred overseas. It crossed decades because the investigation did not immediately produce a prosecution. And it crossed generations because the people responsible for solving it changed over time. One investigator might study the case and retire. Another might inherit the file. Another might revisit it years later. Each investigator would see something different. That is one of the strange characteristics of cold cases. The facts remain the same. The investigators do not. A new investigator can look at an old case and ask a question that nobody previously considered. Not necessarily because earlier investigators were careless. Sometimes the world simply changes. Technology changes. Legal procedures change. Databases expand. Information becomes easier to compare. And a connection that once appeared meaningless can suddenly become important. Amanda's murder had survived through that changing investigative landscape. The original investigation took place in 2001. That was before many of the technologies now considered routine in criminal investigations. Digital evidence was different. Communication was different. Military records were different. The way investigators searched information was different. Even the way people documented their lives was different. That matters. Because 22 years is not merely a long period. It is a technological generation. The tools available in 2001 were not the tools available in 2023. And when a cold case is reopened, investigators can sometimes see old evidence through an entirely different framework. That does not guarantee an answer, but it can create a new opportunity. In Amanda's case, that opportunity eventually resulted in an arrest. The man arrested was Shannon L. Wilkerson, a former soldier. A person prosecutors said had been connected to Amanda's pregnancy. The government argued that he had a motive to kill her, and the federal case transformed the investigation into something the family had not seen before. A formal accusation, a defendant, a trial date. The family could finally sit in a courtroom and hear the government's explanation of what happened. But there was another reality: the defense. Wilkerson had the right to contest the government's allegations. He had the right to challenge the evidence. He had the right to insist that the government prove its case. That is not a technical detail. It is the foundation of the criminal justice system. The fact that a person has been arrested does not establish guilt. The fact that prosecutors believe they know what happened does not establish guilt. Only the verdict can determine criminal responsibility. And the jury eventually returned that verdict. Guilty. Second-degree murder. The words were brief, but behind them stood 22 years of investigation. The family had finally heard what they had wanted to hear. The person prosecuted for Amanda's death had been found responsible under the law. Then came sentencing. 30 years. 30 years in federal prison. A sentence that would become part of Wilkerson's future. But Amanda had no future. That contrast is impossible to escape. One person continued living after November 2001. The other did not. One reached his 40s. The other remained 19 forever. One stood before a judge in 2024. The other remained frozen in photographs from a life that ended in 2001. This is why murder cases cannot be reduced to court documents. Court documents describe charges. They describe evidence. They describe legal findings. But they cannot describe everything that was lost. Amanda's family lost a daughter. They lost birthdays. They lost conversations. They lost future holidays. They lost the chance to watch her become older. They lost the possibility of grandchildren through Amanda. And they lost 22 years wondering whether the person responsible would ever be identified. The federal conviction answered one question, but it could not answer all the others. There are questions families often carry that never appear in an indictment. What would Amanda have looked like at 30? What would she have done with her life? Would she have stayed in the military? Would she have returned to Texas? Would she have married? Would she have had more children? What kind of mother would she have become? None of those questions can be answered. They belong to the life that was stolen. And perhaps that is the most painful aspect of any homicide. The victim loses not only the present. The victim loses every possible future. Every future version of Amanda disappeared on that November day. The soldier, the daughter, the mother, the friend, the woman she might have become. All those possibilities ended at once. The criminal justice system can punish a killer. It cannot prosecute the theft of a future. That loss has no sentence. It cannot be measured in years. It cannot be compensated by a verdict. It simply remains. For Amanda's family, the guilty verdict may have provided something that the cold case never could: a fixed truth. For 22 years, there had been uncertainty. Now there was a judicial finding. That distinction matters. A family can grieve differently when the unanswered question has finally been answered. They can say her name without immediately following it with another question. They can remember Amanda without wondering whether the case will ever be solved. They can look at the investigation as something that finally reached a conclusion, but the emotional scars remain. The case also reveals something about military communities. Young soldiers often live in environments where personal and professional lives overlap. They work together. They live close together. They depend on each other. They form relationships quickly, and they can be thousands of miles from home. When violence occurs inside such a community, the psychological impact can be enormous. Amanda's murder was not simply the killing of a stranger. It happened among people who shared the same institution, the same uniforms, the same military culture, the same environment. That can make a homicide feel even more intimate. Everyone begins wondering, could I have known? Could I have seen something? Did I pass Amanda in the hallway? Did I speak to her? Did I see the person who eventually became the suspect? Did someone behave strangely? Did someone know more than they admitted? These questions can stay with people for years, sometimes decades. The murder also demonstrated how difficult it can be to maintain momentum in a case that crosses international boundaries. Germany was the crime scene. The United States was home to many of the people involved. The military was the institutional environment. Federal law eventually provided the jurisdiction for prosecution. The investigation, therefore, had to move through multiple systems. That complexity can slow cases. It can create administrative barriers. It can make evidence more difficult to access. It can require cooperation between agencies separated by geography and legal systems. Yet the case survived. And that survival eventually became the foundation of the prosecution. When Wilkerson was arrested in Florida, the geography of the case became almost symbolic. The murder had begun in Germany. The investigation had traveled across the Atlantic. The suspect had eventually been located in the United States. And the final judgment was delivered in a federal courtroom thousands of miles from where Amanda died. That distance did not weaken the case. Instead, it demonstrated how far investigators had been willing to go. The crime had occurred decades earlier. But jurisdiction followed the accused. Evidence followed the investigation. And Amanda's name followed both. The final sentence of 30 years did not erase the cold case years. It became part of them. 22 years of uncertainty, then 30 years of imprisonment. Two numbers separated by a life that should have been lived. Those numbers will remain attached to the case for generations. But there is another number that matters more. 19. Amanda was 19 when she died. That number is not simply an age. It represents how much life remained. 19 is the age of someone who is supposed to be discovering the world, making mistakes, building friendships, changing plans, finding a career, falling in love, starting a family, growing older. Amanda was supposed to experience those things. Instead, her family experienced a funeral, and then an investigation, and then years of waiting. That is why the story cannot simply end with a sentence. The legal case ended. Amanda's story did not. Her story continues through the people who remember her, through the investigators who kept the case alive, through the public records that preserve what happened, and through the family members who refuse to allow a 22-year-old mystery to become a forgotten murder. There are countless cold cases in America. Some remain unsolved for decades. Some never produce an arrest. Some victims are eventually forgotten by the wider public. Amanda's case was different. Her family kept asking. Investigators kept working. And eventually, the system produced an answer. That does not make the years disappear. But it means those years were not the final word. For Amanda, the final word was not unknown. It was not unsolved. It was not forgotten. It was a conviction, a sentence, a permanent record, and a name. Chanonel Wilkerson, the name of the man convicted of killing her. Yet even now, the most powerful name remains Amanda, because the center of this story is not the person who was convicted. It is the person who was lost. A young soldier who traveled overseas. A daughter who never came home. A woman whose unborn child never had a chance to be born. A 19-year-old whose future ended before it had truly begun. The investigation may have been about finding a killer, but the reason for the investigation was Amanda. That is why cold case detectives continue opening old files. Not because the files matter, because the people do. Every photograph represents someone who once had a voice. Every case number represents a life. Every unanswered homicide represents a family forced to live without a final explanation. And every solved cold case proves that time does not necessarily have the final victory. Amanda's case remained unresolved for 22 years. But the truth did not disappear. It waited. It survived the closing of the military base. It survived transfers and retirements. It survived changing technology. It survived the death of Amanda's father. It survived 2 decades of silence. And eventually, it reached the courtroom. The jury listened. The evidence was considered. The verdict was delivered. The judge imposed 30 years. And the case moved into history. But history is not the same thing as forgetting. If anything, history is the opposite. It is the record that says this happened. Amanda Gonzalez lived. Amanda Gonzalez served. Amanda Gonzalez was 19. Amanda Gonzalez was pregnant. Amanda Gonzalez was murdered. And for 22 years, her family waited for the justice that finally came. That is the part of the story that should never be lost beneath the legal language. Before there was a cold case, there was a person. Before there was a defendant, there was a daughter. Before there was a verdict, there was a family waiting. And before there was a sentence, there was a young woman who should have had decades ahead of her. Those decades were stolen. The law could punish the person convicted of taking them, but it could never return them. And perhaps that is why the silence surrounding Amanda Gonzalez's murder remained so powerful for so long. Because somewhere beneath every investigation, every report, every courtroom argument, there was a simple absence. Amanda should have been there. She wasn't. And no sentence can ever change that.